The road ran south out of Jerusalem toward Gaza, and Luke attaches one strange word to it. Acts chapter 8, verse 26. Arise, and go toward the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. That is not scenery. It is terrain, the emptier southern route. And a man can still walk that descent today. Somewhere on that stretch, in the middle of the 1st century, a chariot moves south, with a scroll of Isaiah open across a court official's knees. Set that verse on the table and leave it there. No thesis on top of it, no sermon, just a location. The way down from Jerusalem to Gaza is a real descent on a real map, close to 50 miles from the high country to the sea. And Gaza sits at the bottom of it, where the caravan tracks come in off the sand. Luke could have written the road. He wrote, which is desert. I have sat with that one word longer than most people would think it deserves. It is the only exhibit on the table so far, and I want it to stay that way a while. Here is the question this hour is built on. What work does God hand a people to do? Not what does a people deserve. Not who ranks above who. What is the assignment, and has anybody finished it? I have heard that question answered from 100 platforms, and most of the answers arrive before the evidence does. 30 years in a history classroom will spoil a man for that. You learn to ask for the document first and the meaning second. So, here is how I want to work. People talk about a pattern, that God hands particular people's particular jobs, and I am not going to assert it at you. I want to test it against one chapter, one road, one traveler, and see whether the text holds it up or lets it drop. If it holds, you will watch it hold. If it does not, I will say so. And I am not giving you the answer now. The road comes first. The reason comes last. One man on that stretch. One conversation on the shoulder of that road. An hour of it, maybe less. Then a turn back toward the south. And he is gone from the book. Luke never brings him back. Most stories in Acts hand you a name, a city, a church you can go and visit. This one hands you a chariot going away from the camera. What he carried down that road was not a headline. I believe it was a job, and I am holding what that means until the end, because it lands harder once you have seen the ground it stood on. And there is ground. There are steep little pyramids standing in the Sudanese desert, on the river he was riding toward. There are coins that changed their own symbol. There are books written on wood and skin still being turned by hand in African churches this morning. All of it belongs to this story. We start with the road. Start where the walking starts. Jerusalem sits about 2,500 feet above the sea, up in the Judean hills, and every road out of it that runs west or south runs downhill. That is why Luke says, goeth down. I do not think that is a figure of speech. It is a grade. You leave the city gate, and the terraces of olive and vine come with you for a while, and then they thin out. The chalk hills of the Shephelah roll under you next, low and pale, with wheat down in the bottoms. Then the ground flattens, and the air changes. It gets thicker and warmer as you drop toward the coastal plain. A body feels that road in the knees before it feels it anywhere else. And Gaza, at the end of it, is not a small place in the 1st century. It is a port town with a working harbor, and more than that, it is where the desert hands its cargo over to the sea. Caravans had been coming up out of southern Arabia for centuries along the incense route, through the Nabatean country and the rock city of Petra. And Gaza is where that road stops. Goods out of Africa came into the same market. Frankincense, myrrh, ivory, gold, spices bought and taxed and loaded. Gaza is also the last watered town before the Sinai crossing into Egypt. If you were going home to the Nile, you went through Gaza. So why does Luke stop his own sentence to tell us the road is desert? Because there was more than one way to get from Jerusalem toward Gaza. There was the busy line, out through Lydda and down the coast, the trunk route everybody used, with inns and villages the whole way. And there was the southern line, quieter and drier, running through the hill country, past Beit Guvrin, and out along the edge of the Negev. Luke marks which one? The emptier one. When I taught this chapter, I used to skip that clause the way everybody skips it. Here is how I read it now. Luke is not describing the weather. He is telling you there was nobody else out there. Let me put myself in this before I go any further. I taught history to sophomores in the Delta for 30 years, and for most of those years, I handed this chapter. On the way, it had been handed to me, a pleasant little conversion story with a stranger in it. Then in 2004, I went to Ethiopia, and a deacon in Lalibela let me hold a book bound in wood that was older than my King James by centuries. I came home and read Acts 8 again in my father's Bible, the one with his notes crowding the margins. I had always read this chapter as an ending. I have come to believe it is a departure. Now put people on that road, the middle of the 1st century, and Jerusalem runs on a festival calendar. Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. 3 times a year, the city swells with people who traveled to be there. And for days afterward, the roads out of it carry that same crowd home again. Whole families on foot, donkeys under baggage, merchants who time their selling to the crowd, priests and Levites heading back to their own towns. Some going north to Galilee, some west to the coast, some south the long way toward Egypt and past it. Our traveler is in that outbound traffic. The text is plain about why he had been in the city, and I will read you that line shortly. And the word chariot has done some damage over the years. Say it, and people picture a war machine, a light 2-wheeled fighting platform with blades on the axle. That is not what is on this road. The Greek is harma, and here it means what an official rides in. Picture a road vehicle, wheeled, built for distance, with a driver at the reins, and an escort walking or riding alongside, and baggage behind for a journey measured in weeks. Some shade-rigged against the sun. The pace is the pace of an animal walking, 20 miles in a good day, maybe 25. And notice this, he is reading, which means somebody else is driving. Then there is the plain arithmetic of a long haul south, and as far as the record lets us reconstruct it, the whole thing turns on water. Men can ration, animals cannot. You plan a day around where you will stop, and the stops are fixed, wells and cisterns and the towns that grew up around them. Grain has to be bought or carried. Harness breaks, wheels need a right. Jerusalem to Gaza is a matter of days. Gaza to the Egyptian frontier across the Sinai is more. Then the Nile, upriver, cataract after cataract, those rock shelves that break the river and stop a boat cold. However you count it, the trip out of his country and back is the better part of a season. Now Philip. The record is specific about where he came from. Acts chapter 6 verse 5. And the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Ghost, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. 7 men picked in Jerusalem to handle a practical problem, the daily handing out of food, because the widows of the Greek-speaking families were being overlooked. Philip is second on that list. He starts out as an administrator. 2 chapters later, he is somewhere else entirely. Acts chapter 8, verse 5. Then Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ unto them, and it works. The text says, the people gave heed with one accord, that the sick were healed, that the palsied and the lame were carried out to him. And verse 8 gives you the result in 5 words. And there was great joy in that city. He is standing in the middle of the best week of his life. A whole town is listening to him. That is the scene the instruction interrupts. And what does the instruction do? Arise and go toward the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. It lifts him out of a crowded city and sets him down on an empty road. A whole town traded for one man. I have been sitting with that trade for a long time, and I still do not find it comfortable. Everything I was ever taught about doing good work says, you stay where the crowd is. Here is how I read it now, and you may read it different. That is all right. Luke put those two verses side by side on purpose. He wanted you to feel the size of what Philip walked away from before you ever meet the man he walked toward. And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship. Acts chapter 8, verse 27. Read that twice. I will wait, because that is one sentence, and it is the only description of this man that exists anywhere in Scripture. Everything anybody has said about him past that line came from somewhere other than the verse. So let us do the slow thing. Take it apart word by word, and take only what it gives us. Count what Luke actually hands you. 1. He is a man of Ethiopia. That is an origin, a country named. 2. He is a eunuch, which in a royal court of that era describes a physical condition and, very often, a whole class of trusted official who served close to the throne. 3. He is of great authority. Luke uses the word dynasties, the root sitting under our word dynasty, meaning a man with real power in his hands. 4. He has the charge of all her treasure. That is a portfolio, not an errand. The way I count them, 4 facts. Not one of them is a guess, and I want us to build only on those. And then there is the 5th fact, the one people walk right past on the way to the interesting parts. He had come to Jerusalem for to worship. Before he is an African, before he is an officer, before he is a treasurer, this man enters the record as a worshipper. He did not stumble into that city. He crossed the top half of a continent to stand in the courts of a temple, would not have let him past a certain line, and then he turned around and started home. I have come to believe that is the ground floor of the whole story. Whatever else is coming, it starts with a man who had already gone a very long way to seek God. Now I want to say something once, plainly, and then not say it again. The verse gives you this man's origin and his office. It does not describe his appearance, not his face, not his build, not his color. Luke tells us where he was from and what he did for a living. And right there he stops. So I am going to stop where he stopped. I am not going to fill that silence in for you this hour, in either direction. If you have sat with me before, you know that is not a dodge. It is the whole method. The record is honored by reading it, not by decorating it. Because here is what Ethiopia is in Luke's Greek. Ethiopia. To a Greek or a Roman writer in the 1st century, that word names the land south of Egypt, up the Nile, past the frontier, and the kingdom that held it. It is a place on a map with a border, a capital, an army, and a tax system. It is not a description of a person. That kingdom has its own name in its own records, and we will spend real time standing in it shortly, because the man's employer turns out to be one of the better documented courts in the ancient world, and almost nobody in an American pew has ever heard the name. I will admit something to you. When I first started working this chapter, I wanted more than the verse was willing to give me. I wanted the face. I sat at my kitchen table in Memphis with 3 translations open in front of me and caught myself reaching for words. Luke never wrote, because they would have made the story land harder. I put them back down. Here is where I have come out. A record that gets improved stops being a record. And the honest version is stronger anyway, because everything I am about to lay in front of you can be checked by somebody who does not trust me at all. So take the next word, Candace. In English, It lands on the ear like a woman's first name. And for a long time, that is exactly how I read it. The way you would read Deborah or Esther. It is not a name. In the court at Meroe, it is a title. Candace, an office held by a royal woman, generally understood as the mother of the reigning king, carrying standing of her own. Queen Mother is close, but it undersells it. She had a court, an income, tombs built for her, and in at least one case an army out in the field. And you do not have to take that from a Bible teacher, because it is attested outside the Bible entirely by writers with no interest in scripture at all. Strabo, the Greek geographer, writing in Book 17 of his geography, describes a Candace ruling the Ethiopians in the years when Rome was still settling its southern Egyptian frontier. Her forces came down on the Roman garrison towns at the First Cataract. Petronius, the Roman prefect in Egypt, marched back up the river against her and took the old royal city of Napata, and it ended in a negotiated settlement rather than a conquest. That is a Roman general treating that court as a state. Then Pliny the Elder, in Book 6 of his Natural History, writing a couple of generations later, comes at it from the other side. He reaches the town of Meroe and reports that the queen there was called Candace, and he adds the detail that settles the matter. The name, he says, had been passing from queen to queen for many years. Two Roman writers working separately, describing a standing office. So when Luke writes under Candace, Queen of the Ethiopians, he is not being vague. He is naming an institution, and he expects his reader to know it. Most of us were simply never told. Which brings us to the last phrase, and it is the one I think gets undersold the most. Who had the charge of all her treasure? That is not a servant running an errand for a queen. That is a finance ministry in one man's hands. And there is a small thing in the Greek I have never been able to unsee. The word Luke uses for treasure is Gaza, a Persian loanword the Greeks borrowed for a royal treasury. Same letters as the town at the far end of that road. Different words, different roots, no connection at all. But there they both sit in the same chapter, and I smile every time. So what does a treasury mean in a kingdom like that one? Think about what was moving through it. Gold out of the eastern desert mines. Iron, worked at a scale that left slag heaps you can still walk up to. Ebony and ivory and hides going north into the Roman market, and finished goods coming back the other way. Tribute from the towns, duties on the caravans, endowments for the temples. Somebody has to weigh it, store it, count it, pay the army out of it, and answer for whatever comes up short. That is what this man did for a living. Men who do that work are not sentimental, and they are not easily fooled. Now hold those two facts up against each other. A man with that job, and a journey of well over 1,000 miles each way, most of it through desert, months of it, arranged at his own expense to worship in a city where he was a foreigner. Nobody does that by accident. Nobody does it for the scenery. Here is how I read it, and I have sat with this a long while. The trip itself is the evidence. Before a single word passes between him and Philip on that road, the record has already told you what kind of man is sitting in that chariot. He was looking. He had been looking a long time. So follow the money. A treasurer answers to a treasury, and a treasury is not an idea. It has walls, a door, a guard at that door, and a road running up to it. The road this man was traveling ran south. It kept running south long after the Judean hills had dropped away behind his wheels. Follow it far enough, down through Gaza, across the Sinai, into Egypt, then up the Nile against the current, and you arrive at a city standing on the east bank of the river, between the 5th and the 6th of them. That ground lies today in the Republic of Sudan, a couple hundred kilometers northeast of Khartoum. In the 1st century, it carried a different name, Meroe. I want you to feel that distance, because a map flattens it into nothing. Your finger crosses it in half a second. His body crossed it in weeks. Sinai alone is a fortnight of hard travel with animals to water and feed. The Nile above Aswan is not a highway. It is a river broken by rock, which means stretches where the cargo comes off the boat and goes overland on the backs of men and donkeys before it goes back on the water again. Reckon the whole run, Jerusalem to Meroe, and you are looking at many weeks in each direction. Not days, weeks. And he did it, the record says, to worship. Now, Luke writes one word for all of that: Ethiopia. In the Greek of that century, Ethiopia was a wide word. It covered the lands the Greeks knew south of Egypt, and it was not the modern country that carries the name today. The political body behind Luke's word, the court with a throne and a treasury and an army, was the Kingdom of Kush, and by the 1st century its capital sat at Meroe. Here's how I read it, and you may read it different. That's all right. I taught world history in Mississippi classrooms for 30 years, and every textbook they handed me gave Kush about a paragraph, usually as a footnote to Egypt. I believe that paragraph was too small by about 1,000 years, because there is a pyramid field there. Not a pyramid, a field of them. Well over 200 royal tombs stand in the Bagrawia cemeteries outside Meroe, and they do not look like the ones on the Giza postcard. They are steep-sided, narrow, tall for their base, packed close together like a stand of stone trees. Smaller than Khufu's and far more numerous. UNESCO placed the archaeological sites of the island of Meroe on the World Heritage List in 2011. Which is a bureaucratic way of saying, this is not a rumor, it is a site with a fence, a registry number, and a conservation budget. Kings and queens are buried under those points. Then there is the slag. Around Meroe, the archaeologists found mounds of it. The waste left behind when you smelt iron out of ore, heaped up over generations, until the heaps themselves became landmarks. One early English scholar, A.H. Sayce, looked at those mounds a century ago and called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa, comparing it to the great English foundry city of his own day. You can argue with the phrase. You cannot argue with the mounds. Iron means furnaces. Furnaces mean fuel and labor and craftsmen, and iron means tools and weapons that a neighbor has to reckon with. And then there is the writing, which is the part that keeps me up. The people of Meroe had their own script. Two forms of it, one for monuments, one for everyday cursive, and it is an alphabet, not a picture code. Francis Llewellyn Griffith cracked the sound values of it around 1909. So we can stand in front of a Meroitic inscription and pronounce it out loud, syllable by syllable, correctly. And we still do not know what most of it means. The language behind the letters has not been recovered. Read that twice. A whole kingdom left us its own voice on stone, and we can sound it out without understanding a word. Rome knew this kingdom. Around 25 years before Christ, Kushite forces came north and struck Roman holdings in southern Egypt. The prefect of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, marched south in answer and pushed as far as Napata, which he took. Strabo tells the whole account in Book 17 of his geography. But read how it ends. Not with a province annexed and a governor installed, but with envoys traveling all the way to Augustus on the island of Samos, and terms agreed and the tribute remitted. Rome negotiated. That is not the ending Rome usually wrote. 2 generations later, they were still curious. Pliny the Elder, in Book 6 of his Natural History, and Seneca, in his Natural Questions, both record that Nero sent men, centurions, soldiers, not tourists, up the Nile toward Meroe and beyond, looking for the river's source. Seneca says he spoke with them himself and heard their report. Think about what that means. The Emperor of Rome could not simply send for the file. He had to send men on a journey of months and wait and take their word for it when they came back. So set the two exhibits side by side. An independent African court with its own gods and its own temples, its own alphabet, its own army, its own trade in gold and iron and ivory, sitting far enough up the river that the greatest empire on earth dealt with it by treaty rather than by conquest. That is the payroll the man in the chariot was on. Somebody in that treasury signed off on his travel. Somebody approved weeks of absence for a senior finance officer. I've sat with that a long time, and it still moves me. His journey was funded. I have never stood at Meroe. I want to be honest about that, because I have stood in a good many places I talk about. In 2016, I got as far as Aswan, at the first cataract, and I stood at the water's edge, looking south up the river with the sun going down, knowing the pyramids were up there somewhere past 4 more sets of rapids, and a border I did not have the papers for. I used to think of that trip as the one that came up short. I've landed somewhere else now. Standing at Aswan taught me the thing the textbook never did, how far south the world kept going after the page ran out. Now let me say the hard part plainly, once, and then we move on. Everything I just laid out is a kingdom on a map. It is stone, slag, script, and 2 Roman writers. It tells you where this man's wages came from. It does not tell you, and I will not pretend it tells you, anything about the ancestry of anybody watching this. I am making no claim of descent here. Not about you, not about me, not about anyone. The record shows a court in Africa and an officer who served it. That is what the record shows, and that is all I will take from it. And I am not ranking anybody. No people stands above another people in this story or in the book it comes from. The chapter itself will say so out loud before we are finished, in words plainer than mine. I believe that. I have believed it a long time, and I am not going to argue the point. I am just going to keep laying the exhibits out and let them do the work. What I am after is not a hierarchy. It is a job description. So here's where we are. We have a road, a rank, and now a kingdom. What we do not have yet is the reason he came, and the reason is sitting open on his knees. Before we get to it, if Meroe is a name you are hearing for the first time today, comment the one word Meroe below. Just that. I ask because I taught this material for 30 years, and I would rather see that answer in numbers than carry it as a hunch. Then stay with me, because the next exhibit is not stone. It is parchment. Here is the next exhibit, and it fits in 2 hands. Acts chapter 8, verse 28. Was returning, and sitting in his chariot read Esaias the prophet. Verse 29. Then the Spirit said unto Philip, Go near, and join thyself to this chariot. And verse 30. And Philip ran thither to him, and heard him read the prophet Esaias, and said, Understandest thou what thou readest? Now slow down and catch the verb in verse 30. Philip heard him read, not saw him reading, heard. That one word carries more than it looks like it carries. In the ancient world, reading was normally done out loud. The eye ran the letters, and the mouth said them. That was simply how it was done, from a schoolroom in Alexandria to a scribe's bench in Jerusalem. Silent reading existed, but it was odd enough to be remarked on. Augustine, writing centuries later, thought it worth recording that Ambrose read without moving his lips. So, the man in the chariot was not skimming. He was speaking Isaiah into the desert air, over the noise of wheels and animals, loud enough that a man on foot at the roadside could make out the words. And that is the only reason this encounter is physically possible. Take away the reading aloud, and Philip walks past a stranger in a vehicle and has nothing to open with. Instead, he catches the passage on the wind, recognizes it, and asks the plainest question in the whole chapter. Understandest thou what thou readest? Look at the answer in verse 31. How can I, except some man should guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. No offense taken, no rank pulled. A senior officer of a foreign court says, in effect, "I do not follow this," and then makes room on the bench. I've sat with that response for years. It is the response of a man who came a very long way to learn something and had not yet learned it. So what was he reading? Luke tells us exactly, which is not something Luke always does. Verse 32. The place of the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. Verse 33. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. That is not a paraphrase, and it is not a summary. Luke gives us the column he was looking at. The source is Isaiah chapter 53, verses 7 and 8. And the wording Luke preserves matters, because it is not word for word what you will. Find if you open an English Bible at Isaiah and read those verses in Hebrew translation. It follows the Greek, the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures made for Greek-speaking readers in Egypt beginning around the 3rd century before Christ. Greek was the working language of the Eastern trade routes and of educated officials across that world. Exactly what a treasury man from Meroe could buy in Jerusalem and read on the way home. Here's how I read it. The scroll on his lap has a manufacturing history, and that history runs through Africa too. Now sit with the passage itself for a second, because he did. A figure who is led, a figure who does not answer back, a figure whose judgment is taken away and whose life is taken from the earth, and a line that must have gone through him like cold water. Who shall declare his generation? A man with no children, reading about a man with no line to declare. Then verse 34, and this is his question, in his own mouth. I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself or of some other man? That is not a lazy question. That is the exact question the passage forces on anybody who reads it honestly, and it was still being argued over by teachers far better trained than him. He does not ask for comfort, and he does not ask for a lesson on his own condition. He asks for an identification. Who is it? And before we hear a word of Philip's answer, I want to stay with the object in his hands a little longer, because the scroll itself is evidence, and it has been telling us something since verse 28 that most of us walk right past. Think about what he is holding. Not a book. Books with pages bound at the spine were barely getting started. A scroll, prepared animal skin, scraped and stretched and cut into sheets, then sewn edge to edge into one long strip and wound onto rollers. Isaiah is 66 chapters. That is not a pocket item. Every letter on it was put there by hand, one at a time, by a trained copyist who could ruin a whole sheet with one lapse of attention and have to start it again. Months of work, a herd's worth of skins. There was no shop where you picked one off a shelf for pocket change. We know what such a scroll looked like, because we have one. In 1947, a scroll came out of a cave at Qumran above the Dead Sea that we now call the Great Isaiah Scroll. All 66 chapters, 17 sheets of parchment sewn together, 54 columns of Hebrew, about 24 feet long when you unroll it. It is roughly a century older than the road we are standing on. You can see it today in Jerusalem, in the shrine of the book. I have stood in front of that case longer than the guard thought was reasonable. What struck me was not the age. It was the labor, the sheer human hours lying there under the glass. So price it out. A personal copy of Isaiah, in Greek, purchased by a traveler and loaded into his vehicle for a journey of weeks. That is not a souvenir. That is a serious sum of somebody's money, and I believe it was his own. And here is what that tells me before Philip ever opens his mouth. This man had already decided something. He crossed a desert to worship at a temple that, under the rules as they stood, could only let him so far in. Then he spent real money on the text and pointed it homeward. Nobody preached him into that. He was already reading when the story finds him. Which brings us to the part of this I went back and forth on including, because it is easy to overplay. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1. It is blunt. A man wounded or cut in the way this man's office required shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. That is the ruling that stood over him in Jerusalem. He had come weeks to worship, and the law as it was applied kept him at a distance from the innermost part of it. Most retellings I grew up hearing stopped right there and made him a figure of exclusion, full stop. I taught it that way myself for a good while. But he is holding Isaiah. And Isaiah chapter 56, 3 chapters further along the same role he already owns, says this. Verse 3, Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. Verse 4 speaks of the eunuchs that keep God's Sabbaths and take hold of his covenant. And then verse 5, Even unto them will I give in mine house, and within my walls a place, and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Now let me be careful here, because I do not want to claim more than the page gives. Luke does not tell us he read chapter 56. Luke tells us he was in chapter 53. I cannot put chapter 56 in front of his eyes, and I will not. What I can tell you is where it was, on the same sheepskin, wound on the same rollers, a few turns of his own 2 hands away. The door was already written. It had been written for centuries. It was sitting in the vehicle with him while he asked a stranger who the prophet was talking about. That is not proof of anything, and I am not offering it as proof. It is where the evidence stops, and so I stop with it. The man had asked his question, and the road kept moving under the wheels. Of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself or of some other man? He asked it out loud, on a stretch of open country, to a stranger who had climbed up beside him a few minutes earlier. And here is what the record gives us next. Acts chapter 8, verse 35. Then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture, and preached unto him Jesus. Read that line again, slow. Began at the same scripture. Not a different one, not a better one. The same column of text already unrolled across this man's knees. Notice what Philip does not produce. He does not pull a second scroll out of his bag. He does not tell the traveler to turn the chariot around and come back to Jerusalem for a proper hearing. He does not name a council, a temple office, or a letter of recommendation. He has no building behind him and no title in front of him. The answer starts inside the document, the traveler already owned and already paid for. When I taught this to my students, I would stop right here and ask them what that means about the evidence. It means the case was made from the exhibit already on the table. Philip added the reading. He did not add the record. And now the part I want you to hear plainly, because it is an absence, and absences are easy to walk past. There is no rebuke in this passage. Nobody corrects this man for his office, for his kingdom, for his condition, or for the long way he had come. There is no interrogation. Philip asks him nothing about his court, nothing about his queen, nothing about how he came by an expensive scroll. And there is no condition attached, no waiting period, no probation, no fee, no oath, no test to pass first. I have read this chapter for 30 years looking for the fine print. Here is how I read it now. There isn't any. You may read it different, and that is all right. They keep moving, and then the ground does something. Acts chapter 8, verse 36. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water. And the eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? Verse 37 in the King James reads, And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. I will tell you straight, because that is how I work. Verse 37 is absent from the oldest Greek copies we have and appears in later ones, which is why some Bibles bracket it or move it to a footnote. That is a manuscript fact. It is not an accusation against anybody. Then verse 38, and he commanded the chariot to stand still, and they went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. Look at who is speaking in this scene. The request does not come from Philip. Philip does not press him, does not close, does not ask him for a decision. What doth hinder me to be baptized? That is the traveler's own sentence. He is the one who saw the water. He is the one who asked the question. And then he is the one who gives the order, because on that road he is the only man with the standing to give one. Sit with that a second. I will wait. The whole column stops. The driver, the animals, whatever escort a treasury officer travels with, all of it halted in open country on one man's word. And then both of them go down into the water. Not the official standing dry on the bank while a holy man performs something over him. Both. The man who ran a kingdom's money and the man who had been run out of Jerusalem, standing in the same water, in the same dust, under the same sun. Between you and me, that picture has never let go of me. Where that water actually was, though, that is a harder question, and I owe you an honest answer about it. Where was the water? I want to give you a real answer, and the real answer has edges. Luke writes, a certain water. That is all he writes. No village name, no spring name, no landmark you could stand next to. So people who care about this have spent centuries trying to put a pin in that map. The oldest of those traditions points to Ein Hanya, a spring in the valley southwest of Jerusalem, sitting on an old road that runs down out of the hills. Byzantine-era pilgrims attached this story to that spring, and a church went up beside it. The site has been excavated and reopened to visitors in recent years. It is a beautiful candidate. The other candidates sit further down the same descent, out where the hills flatten toward the coastal plain, near what the Romans later called Eleutheropolis, and what the map today calls Beit Guvrin. That country is cut by wadis, seasonal stream beds, and if that word is new to you, it simply means a channel that runs hard in the winter rains and lies dry as bone by high summer. Anyone who has walked that ground knows how the water behaves out there. You can cross one of those beds in March and find it running. Cross the same bed in August and you find white stone and nothing else, which is exactly the problem. A traveler in Acts 8 could have come on water at half a dozen crossings, and not one of them left a receipt. So here is what the record cannot do, said once, without apology. It cannot settle this. There is no inscription at any of those sites naming this man. There is no first-century marker, no coin, no letter, nothing written at the time that says, here, this crossing, this afternoon. The Byzantine tradition is a tradition, old, real, worth knowing, and still written down generations after the fact. I have sat with that a long time and made my peace with it. This is the rule I work by, and I will say it out loud so you can hold me to it. Where the evidence stops, the narration stops. I used to want the pin in the map more than I wanted the truth. It took me years to admit that. What the record does give us is what happened when the two of them came up. Acts chapter 8, verse 39. And when they were come up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord caught away Philip, that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. Caught away, gone. The very next verse puts Philip at Azotus, up the coast, already preaching through other towns. Think about what Luke has just done to his own scene. He has taken the evangelist out of the frame entirely. No follow-up visit, no packet of instructions. No second meeting scheduled for the return trip. Count what the man has left on that chariot bench. A wet robe. A scroll of Isaiah he bought with his own money. A road. That is the whole inventory. There is nobody riding beside him to check his doctrine. Nobody to correct him at mile 40. Nobody sending letters back to Jerusalem about how he is holding up. Philip taught him for one afternoon and was then removed from the story completely. And the man went on his way rejoicing. That is Luke's phrase, not mine. It is worth noticing that Luke chose to end this scene on the traveler's face and not on the preacher's. Now, the detail I have been sitting on since the first minute of this hour. Watch which way that chariot is pointed. Philip goes north, up toward Azotus and the coast towns, and Luke follows him for exactly one sentence before dropping the thread. The traveler goes the other way. He is heading south, down the descent, out past Gaza, into the caravan country, toward Egypt, and then up the river, weeks of it, all the way home. That direction is the whole thing. I am not going to decode it for you yet, because I want you to see the calendar first. But keep the compass in your hand. South, south, not west. That is the sentence I have been holding back for the better part of an hour, and I am going to set it on the table now. This man did not turn toward Rome. Rome was the capital. Rome was the road, everybody assumes. The story runs down, and he never pointed a wheel at it. He went home. And here is the part I believe matters more than the direction. What he carried back down that road was not a message only, it was work. A man who is handed news tells it once and moves on with his life. A man who is handed a job carries it the rest of the way, across the desert, past the cataracts, into a court where he already had a seat and a voice. Set the map of that century next to Acts chapter 1 verse 8. But ye shall receive power, after that the Holy Ghost is come upon you. And ye shall be witnesses unto me, both in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and in Samaria, and unto the uttermost part of the earth. The uttermost part of the earth. We hear that phrase and our minds go to oceans and continents nobody in that room had ever heard of. That is our map, not theirs. On their map, the phrase had an address. Greek writers had been pointing at that address for centuries. Homer put the Ethiopians at the farthest edge of the inhabited world, the most distant of men. Herodotus, in the third book of his histories, set them at the boundary of the known south, past the last stretch anybody could describe. That was not a compliment or an insult. It was geography, the label a Mediterranean writer reached for when he meant the end of the line. And on the afternoon, Luke describes, a man from exactly that far country is sitting in a chariot on the Gaza road with his wheels already turned toward it. The order in Acts 1 named a direction. The chariot in Acts 8 was already pointed down it. I want to stop the tape here and tell you where I have been wrong. For 30 years I stood in front of a classroom in the Delta with a pull-down map, and when I taught this chapter, I taught it the way it was taught to me. Jerusalem, then Antioch, then Asia, then Greece, then Rome, one clean arrow moving west, and Acts 8 as a nice detour on the side of the page. A footnote with a chariot in it. In 2004, I was in Ethiopia, in Lalibela, and a deacon let me hold a copy of a book bound in wood, older than my King James by centuries, kept and copied by people who had never needed my arrow. I came home and read Acts 8 again at my father's desk, in his Bible, in the margins he had filled before he died. I had been skipping the verse that mattered. I still go back and forth on how much weight one man's road should carry. But I no longer think Luke put this chapter here by accident, and I have sat with that a long time. Now the calendar, because that is where this stops being a feeling and starts being a record you can check. Luke is not a careless writer. He tells his story in an order, and Acts 8 sits early in it. It comes before Acts chapter 10 and the household of Cornelius at Caesarea, which is the moment the book treats as the great opening of the door. It comes before Acts chapter 11, before believers scattered north to Antioch, and before anybody was called a Christian there. It comes before Acts chapter 13, before Barnabas and Saul were ever sent out on a first journey. All of that is still ahead of the page you are looking at. And Rome? Rome is nowhere in Acts 8. The first firm documentary evidence of an assembly in the capital is a letter, Paul's letter to the Romans, written around the year 57, addressing believers who are clearly already gathering there. That letter is solid ground. You can hold it, date it, and read the names in the last chapter. There is one earlier scrap, and I will handle it honestly rather than lean on it. Suetonius, writing his life of Claudius, mentions the emperor expelling Jews from Rome over disturbances stirred up at the instigation of someone he spells Chrestus, around the year 49. And Acts chapter 18 verse 2 does put Aquila and Priscilla leaving Italy under exactly that expulsion. Many readers take that as an early trace of Christians in the city. Others read Chrestus as a different man entirely. I lean toward the first reading, and I will not build a floor on a plank that scholars are still arguing about. So here is where I land, and I want you to hear it as a reading of the record rather than a verdict. Most of us were handed a story that moves west out of Jerusalem, and only west. The order in Luke's own book does not read that way to me. In the pages he wrote, a southbound road was traveled before the record shows an assembly in the capital. That is a sequence on a page, nothing more and nothing less. It ranks nobody above anybody, and I will say more about that shortly. But the order is there, and I think it deserves to be read out loud. So the road south was traveled early. Earlier than the letter, earlier than the capital, earlier than most of what we picture when we picture the spread of this faith. And then Luke does something that used to frustrate me. He closes the chapter. The man rides off, and Luke never writes his name again. Not in Acts 9, not in Acts 15, not anywhere. For a historian, that is the moment the film runs out mid-scene. Everything that comes after that verse comes from other hands, written down later, by men who were not standing on that road. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the place where careful gets abandoned. The earliest of those hands belongs to a man named Irenaeus. He was a bishop at Lyon, in Gaul, writing in Greek somewhere around the year 180, roughly a century and a half after the Chariot. In his work, Against Heresies, Book 3, he writes about this same traveler. And he says the man was sent as a preacher into the regions of Ethiopia, to the people he came from. That is the sentence. Irenaeus does not say who told him. He does not cite a document. He writes it the way a man writes something everybody in his circle already assumed. And that, on its own, is worth noting, because it means the tradition was old enough by 180 to be treated as common knowledge rather than news. The second hand belongs to Eusebius, bishop at Caesarea, working in one of the great libraries of the ancient world, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century. In Book 2, he tells the same story, this officer of the Queen's court going home as the first messenger of the faith to his own nation. Eusebius had access to shelves most people have never had access to since. Some of the books he quotes exist today only because he quoted them. So when he repeats a tradition, I take it seriously. Seriously is not the same word as settled. Here is where I have to be straight with you, and I have not always been. When I taught this to my students, I would put Irenaeus and Eusebius on the board, and let the room believe the case was closed, because it made a better ending. It took me years to stop doing that. What we have is two writers, separated by 150 years, recording the same tradition. That is what a tradition is. It is not a verified event. It is not a signed record from the road itself. And the difference matters, because the moment I hand you a tradition dressed up as a fact, you have every right to stop believing the rest of what I tell you. So I will say it plain. I believe the tradition points somewhere real. I cannot hand you the receipt. What I can hand you is the text, and the text is not vague at all. Read the chapter again and count what the man actually does. He is on a road with a scroll he cannot unlock. A stranger asks if he understands it. He says he cannot and asks for help. He listens. He asks a question of his own. He asks to be baptized. He goes down into the water, comes up, and goes on his way rejoicing, southbound, with the scroll still on his lap. Hear it, receive it, carry it home. That is the whole job description, and it fits on a single line. And notice what is not in that line. There is no clause making him the owner of it. No verse tells him he now holds something other people cannot have. 2 chapters later, Luke shows us Peter standing in a Roman officer's house in Caesarea, saying words I have read 1,000 times and still slow down for. Of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Acts 10, verses 34 and 35. Every nation, not one, every. I sat with those 2 verses for a long stretch of years, because I grew up hearing this story used as a boundary line, as though one people held something another could not. Here is how I read it now, and you may read it different, and that is all right. The assignment in Acts 8 is a task, not a title deed. A man was handed work, and he took it home. Luke then places Peter's sentence right behind it, like a man widening a doorway on purpose. In every nation. The record keeps opening the door wider. I do not see it closing anywhere. So let me set the limits down once, plainly, and then move on without arguing about them. No people is ranked above another in this story. No group owns salvation. And I am not making a claim about anybody's ancestry, living or dead. There is no date on any of this, no clock, no countdown, and no modern country, no modern leader, no headline from this week belongs anywhere near a 1st century road between Jerusalem and Gaza. That road is old dirt, and it deserves to be read as old dirt. But here is the thing about work that actually gets carried home. It leaves something behind. If a man rode south with something in his hands, then somewhere down that Nile there ought to be stone, and coins, and ink. Objects a person can still stand in front of. There are. And that is where I want to take you next. Start with a coin. Not a scroll, not a sermon, a coin, because a coin is a government talking about itself in metal. In the 4th century, the Kingdom of Aksum, in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia, was minting its own gold, silver and bronze, and every piece carried the same royal emblem on the face, a disc and a crescent. Then, under a king named Ezana, the emblem changes. The disc and crescent come off. A cross goes on. Same mint, same kingdom, same currency circulating out to the Red Sea trade. And the symbol on the money is different. I want you to sit with what that actually took. Changing a coin is not a private decision. It is a treasury decision, a trade decision, a decision every merchant from the Nile to the coast of India is going to hold in his hand and read. Nobody changes the face of the state's money over a mood. I have handled Aksumite coins in a case in Addis Ababa, and they are small, thin, unremarkable to look at. And they are one of the clearest exhibits I know of, because they date themselves. A cross on a 4th century African coin is a government putting a decision on the record where it cannot be quietly walked back. Alongside the coins, the church historians preserve a name, Frumentius. Rufinus, writing in Latin around the year 400, tells the story of a young man shipwrecked on that coast, who ends up serving in the Aksumite court, and who later travels to Alexandria and is consecrated there by Athanasius as bishop for the Aksumites. That is what the historians record. It is a written tradition, and I will call it that. But the anchor is not the story. The anchor is the ground. Go to Aksum today, and the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion is standing there. Rebuilt, layered, argued over by archaeologists, and standing. You do not need my word for any of this. You need a plane ticket. Now come off the stone and put your hand on parchment, because this is the part I keep returning to. In a monastery on a hillside in the Tigray region, Abba Garima, there are 2 gospel books written in gears, bound in wood, illuminated in ochre and deep red. For most of the last century, people assumed they were medieval. Then radiocarbon testing on the parchment put them, roughly, in the 4th through 6th centuries, not copies of copies from the late Middle Ages. Some of the oldest surviving illuminated gospel books anywhere, sitting in Africa, on a hill, kept by monks whose successors are still there. And then there is the canon itself. The Ethiopian Tewahedo Church holds books that other churches let go of. The Book of Enoch, which was quoted in the letter of Jude and then dropped out of Greek and Latin use almost entirely. Ethiopia kept it. Maccabean, the Ethiopic books of the Maccabees, distinct from the ones in Western Bibles. Ethiopia kept those too. For centuries, if you were a European scholar who wanted to read Enoch in full, you could not. The complete text came back to the West in the 1700s because an African church had never stopped copying it. I want to be precise about the word I am using, because precision is the whole method here. The word is custody. Those books survived because that church kept copying them. One scribe, one reed pen, one sheet of prepared skin at a time, for well over 1,000 years. That is a documented fact about an institution and its scriptorium. It is not a claim about anyone's blood, and I am not making one. What the record shows is labor, generations of people who decided a text was worth the ink and did the work. I have stood in a room where a deacon brought a book out, wrapped in cloth, and set it down on a table, and turned the pages for me. And I did not say much, because I did not have much to say. Here is where I have landed after years of sitting with it. Whatever else you make of the tradition, custody is not an accident. Somebody had to keep it, and the keeping did not stop in the Ethiopian highlands. It went down the river, follow the Nile north out of Meroe, back along the same water his chariot was pointed toward. And from the 6th century onward, you run into 3 kingdoms: Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia. Nubian kingdoms, Christian kingdoms, with their own bishops, their own churches, their own treaties with Egypt to the north. Not an outpost of somebody else's mission. States, with courts and cathedrals and a written liturgy. On the exact river, this story has been traveling since the first verse. I am not connecting them to the traveler by a line of descent. I am telling you what stood on that water and when. And some of it we only have because of a flood. In the 1960s, the Aswan High Dam was rising, and the reservoir behind it was going to swallow a stretch of Nubia whole. Archaeological teams raced the water. A Polish mission working at a site called Pharos dug into a mound of sand and found a cathedral inside it. Walls still carrying painted murals, bishops and saints, and a Nubian queen mother, colors still holding after 1,000 years under the dune. They cut the paintings off the walls to save them. You can go look at them today in the National Museum in Warsaw. A cathedral out of the Sudanese desert, hanging in a gallery in Poland. Farther upriver is Old Dongola, the capital of Makuria, where excavation has turned up church after church. A throne hall converted into a mosque centuries later, and Greek and Old Nubian inscriptions in the plaster. Put the span together and say it out loud. because it is the part that gets left out. Roughly 1,000 years of Christianity in Nubia. Not a moment. Not a footnote. 10 centuries on the same river. And most people who grew up in church in this country have never once heard the word Mercuria. Now cross the continent west, because the record does not stop at the Nile either. The oldest dated Latin Christian document we have does not come from Rome. It comes from Africa. It is the account of the Silatan martyrs, a hearing in Carthage in the year 180, a proconsul questioning a group of North African believers, their answers written down as a court record, names, a date, a place. Whatever you were taught about where this faith did its early thinking, the earliest page of it in Latin was written on African soil, and the voices that follow are the ones that built Western theology's vocabulary. Tertullian, writing at Carthage around the turn of the 3rd century, hammering out Latin words for ideas that had only existed in Greek. Cyprian after him, bishop of the same city, executed there in 258, and Augustine at Hippo Regius, on the coast of what is now Algeria, a man whose books have never been out of print in 1600 years. Carthage, Hippo, African cities. That is not a corner of the story. For a long stretch, that was the engine room. Most of us were handed a map where this faith moves north and west, and then, much later, comes back down to Africa, carried by somebody else. Here is how I read the exhibits, and you are free to read them different. The coins were minted in Aksum. The gospel books were copied at Abba Garima. The murals came out of Faris. The oldest Latin page was recorded at Carthage. And out in Egypt's eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea, the monastery of St. Anthony has had monks in it since the 4th century. One community, without a break, longer than most nations have existed. I have stood at its gate in the heat and thought about how quiet the oldest things are. None of that is an argument I have to make. It is a table with objects on it. Stone, metal, ink, plaster, and a walled monastery that never emptied out. I have laid them down, one at a time on purpose, because a case built out of feeling can be talked away in an afternoon, and a case built out of what is still standing cannot. So the record is on the table now, which leaves the question the hook asked, still sitting there, waiting for a plain answer. Stone at Aksum, ink at Abba Garima, painted plaster lifted out of the sand at Faris and hung on a wall in Warsaw, a monastery in Egypt's eastern desert that has not shut its doors since the 4th century. That is the table. Every object on it sits downstream of one afternoon on a road between Jerusalem and Gaza. So let me answer the question this hour was built on, and let me answer it the way I promised, from the record and from nothing else. What is the work? Count what the man in Acts 8 actually does, and then stop counting when he stops. He hears it, he receives it, he carries it home. 3 verbs. That is the whole assignment the text puts in his hands. Now notice what is not in that list. No rank is conferred on him. No verse tells him he now holds something other people are locked out of. He is not made an owner. He is handed a job, and a job travels. And when the record finally shows us the end of all this carrying, it does not narrow down to one court or one continent. John writes it in Revelation 7 verse 9. After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne. No man could number. All nations and kindreds and people and tongues. The way I read it, the assignment does not shrink as the record moves forward. It widens. Shared with every nation, owned by none of them. And if you are still with me this deep, let me talk to you plain for a second, the way I would across a porch rail. I taught history for 30 years in Mississippi, and then Memphis. And for most of those years, I taught this chapter as a footnote. A strange man, a strange road, onto the next unit. It took a deacon in Lalibela in 2004, putting a wood-bound Gears manuscript in my hands. Before I understood, I had been skipping the part that mattered. I used to read Acts 8 as a detour. I read it now as a door. Here is how I read it. You may read it different, and that is all right. Which brings me to the part I do not want to rush. Scripture invites us into the story. What you saw today is one telling. The text is deeper than any retelling can capture. And I know that better at 60 than I did at 40, when I was more certain about more things. I have sat with this chapter for years, and I still find sentences in it I walked past the first 10 times. So take what I laid on the table as one man's careful reading of the record, checked where it could be checked, and left open where it could not. Let me set the limits down once more, calmly, and then I am done arguing about them. I have made no claim about any living person's ancestry. Not yours, not mine, not anybody's. An ancient kingdom on a map is a kingdom on a map. There is no date on any of this, no clock, no countdown, and I will not put one there. And no modern country, no modern leader, no headline from this month belongs anywhere near a first-century road between Jerusalem and Gaza. That road is old dirt. It has earned the right to be read as old dirt. Here is what I would rather you do than take my word for it. Close this video and open Acts chapter 8. Read the whole thing, all 40 verses, slow, out loud if you can, the way that man was reading his scroll when Philip first heard him. Watch how little Luke says and how much he manages to put in it. You may land somewhere I did not. My father would have read that chapter and gone quiet for a while. And I understand him better now than I did in 2011. Cleaning out his library and finding his King James with the margins full of pencil. Before I close it out, comment the one word, Meroe. Just that. I want to see how many of you had never once heard the name of the city his chariot was pointed toward. Because I taught school for 3 decades, and I never heard it either until I went looking. Send this to somebody who reads. You know exactly which one of your people. I mean, the one with books stacked on the nightstand. And subscribe if you want the next reel of the record. Because there is more of this footage on the cutting room floor than there is in the movie, and I intend to keep pulling it back. Sit with that a second, then let me pray us out. Father, thank you for the road. Thank you for the scroll, and for the man who could not read it alone and had sense enough to say so. Thank you for the stranger who sat down beside him and started right where he already was. Bless every nation watching this tonight. Every nation, every kindred, every people, every tongue, the whole great multitude no man can number. Bless the ones far from home. Bless the ones carrying something they have not yet handed on. And bless the man or woman who came to this looking for their own people in the record and found a road instead. Keep us honest with what is written. Keep us patient with what is not. Amen. Not a retelling. The cut footage of history restored. Walk remembered. Walk forward. One last word before you go. Everything you heard tonight, I read from Scripture. I am not summoning anything, and I am not here to make you afraid of the dark. I am here to make you stand in awe of the God who rules it. I quote the King James Version, unless I say otherwise. The shadow is real, but it is not the last word. He is.